Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great joy to welcome you to the university this evening and to see colleagues from across the university and friends from outside the university as well. This evening's inaugural lecture is the end of our series for this year, which started, as you know, with several young professors at the beginning of the year and ends with this one of, as you know, our new Dean of Education, Professor Carroll-Meehan. Inaugural lectures at this university have a tradition all of their own. As you know, we take them seriously and we celebrate each professor individually and personally. And I'm always delighted to see colleagues from across the university come to join us. And of course, to see such a good representation from Cate's own school. Inaugural lectures are things you remember as a senior scholar long after you've given them, because it marks you being awarded a chair in your field, which is the highest distinction a scholar can have. Getting a PhD is important because then you're a doctor in your field. And the next big thing in a scholar's life is being awarded a personal chair, or a chair, depending how a university constitutes it. And when you give your inaugural lecture, which I remember I did in Pretoria for the first time, and then did it a couple of times after, I remember the people who were there, and I remember my own parents. My father, for instance, it was his last public event when he managed to walk just about to this event in Pretoria, and in their Senate room, like ours, attended. And so I'm especially delighted to welcome today Professor Carroll-Meehan's mother, which travelled all the way from Australia. And it's a special delight, ma'am, to have you with us, because I know what my father said to me when I was made a professor for the first time, and I'm delighted that we can celebrate it with you, and you could be with us. So welcome to the university, everybody. Also, it's a great evening to join us, because if you came half an hour or 45 minutes earlier, you would have seen the Christmas lights switch on, which is a tradition we've started, and now everybody looks forward to it, and none more so than I, because I look forward to it every year, because you see the students and you have this wonderful celebration of light in the dark English evenings, which we from the South, Cate, still will take us a few more decades to get used to. But at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, it's so dark. It's just so cheerful to have these Christmas lights reminding us it is the birth of Christ, and we are here to celebrate light in the midst of darkness. Tonight we're going to have our Pro-Vice Chancellor to introduce our new professor, who, and you know, she's made a journey all the way, like me, from the Antipodes. And I hope you will be as happy as I have been for 20-odd years, Cate, because I came 20 years ago and stayed and enjoyed every year of it. And this is the very last inaugural lecture I shall preside over, and I'm delighted it's yours. Professor Naga is now going to introduce our speaker for the evening. Professor Naga.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Distinguished guests, colleagues, may I also extend my welcome to you all to this inaugural lecture tonight. I am delighted to have the opportunity this evening to introduce Professor Catherine Carroll-Meehan as the most recent addition to Hope's Professoriate, a body of distinguished academics that the university has been building up over the past several years. Professor Carroll-Meehan has joined us as the Dean and Head of the School of Education. She has come to us with already well-earned renown from her previous work at previously held positions, most recently after providing leadership for 4 years at the University of Portsmouth. She has been given a personal chair here at this university, which is entitled Professor of Education and Pedagogy, in recognition for her distinguished academic career and achievements, for her leadership and her research profile, a glimpse of which I would like to give in this introduction tonight. Professor Carroll-Meehan was trained as an early childhood teacher specializing in education for children from birth to 8 years during a diploma of education which she completed from the Queensland University of Technology, Brisbane, Australia. In her final year of this diploma, she commenced a 4-year Bachelor of Education degree, leading to a qualified teacher status. Her working career with children commenced with teaching 5-year-olds in one of the most socially and economically deprived suburbs of Brisbane, with high levels of children from refugee and asylum seekers and intergenerational poverty and unemployment. This experience provided her with the necessary knowledge and first-hand experience of the transformative nature of education. In her next career step was to run a 24-hour childcare center in the largest public hospital in Brisbane. This complex role led to her seeking out further study, undertaking a postgraduate diploma in education, which was an offer from the education and business faculty majoring in educational management. And this was closely followed by a master's degree in education, both the qualifications from Queensland University of Technology. She continued to work in educational management until an opportunity came up to move into teaching in schools, both Catholic and state schools. Starting her doctoral studies during maternity leave saw her embarking on a career change, working as a tutor on teacher education courses at Australian Catholic University. She enrolled to undertake part-time doctoral studies. During this period, she held a series of fixed-term contracts at Australian Catholic University, Griffith University, and Queensland University of Technology. In the final stages of completing her PhD, she was employed as a senior lecturer in early childhood at Canterbury Christ Church University at Kent here in the UK in September of 2006, and she was promoted to principal lecturer in learning and teaching in the year 2009. There, she continued to lead and develop the early childhood subject until 2016 in the capacity of program director and faculty director of early childhood. In the year 2010, jointly with another colleague, she was awarded a 1.5 million funding contract with the Children's Workforce Development Commission to develop and run a pilot for early years based on the success of the Teach First model. This project and her work was referred to in 3 cross-party reviews about children, poverty, and quality of early childhood education. The project was intensive and innovative, including placements, a full MA or master's provision, early years professional status or EYPS, and a CPD program that was personalized to more than 50 participants. This new Leaders in Early project was a success, but a victim of the political winds of change and the shifting of the focus of the Department of Education, as well as the birth of the early years initial teacher training qualification. Professor Carroll-Meehan was awarded a Principal Fellowship of the Higher Education Academy in the year 2015 in recognition for her leadership across Canterbury Christ Church University in teaching and learning, and this was above and beyond the scope of her role as a faculty director at that institution. Professor Carroll-Meehan was interim head of School of Childhood and Education at Canterbury Christ Church University, and after 12 years of contributions there, when an opportunity came up to lead a newly formed school following a restructuring at the University of Portsmouth, she moved there to take up the role of head of education and sociology. During that role, she was recognized with the Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Innovation and for excellence in innovative childcare arrangement for staff working from home during the pandemic. This solution provided respite for many parents using Zoom to run study buddy sessions, enabling invaluable placement experience for early childhood and child and youth studies students who were unable to undertake placements due to the COVID-19 lockdown in 2001. Professor Carroll-Meehan worked with colleagues to establish the University of Portsmouth Academy Trust. The trust adopted being, belonging, and becoming as core values which underpins the work of those schools. And indeed, there is so much more I can perhaps outline from our inaugural lecturer tonight, but in the interest of time, it is a genuine delight and joy for me now to invite Professor Carroll-Meehan to deliver to us her inaugural lecture entitled My Journey to Hope, Being, Belonging, and Becoming.
Thank you. My pages aren't numbered, so I need to be very careful that I don't drop them. But thank you very much, Professor Pillay, for your warm welcome, Professor Naga, Professor Newport, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor Horn, and my colleagues from the School of Education, distinguished guests, and of course my family and friends that are here. It's very hard to believe that I'm here, but I'm just going to go through this and we'll see how it goes. And as I tell the story of how I got to Hope, hopefully for those colleagues that are only new colleagues to me will understand where I come from and how I hope that we'll work in the future. So it is a great pleasure to be here and a real privilege. And it was only 2 weeks ago that I attended the inaugural lecture of Professor David Reed. Now, it was my first inaugural lecture, so I was really keen to come to find out what happens, so it was really good to have that experience. And as I've only been working here for 2 months, tonight's lecture will be different to other inaugural lectures where you may have known some for a long time. It's an opportunity for me to introduce myself to you. So the title of my lecture, My Journey to Hope, is both literal and metaphorical. I've got to remember to change the slides. That would be helpful. Paulo Freire talks about being a teacher, and he said, I cannot be a teacher without exposing who I am. And so as an educator, this lecture will explore my lifelong educational journey in terms of my work and research, but it also cuts across both personal and professional. And my own educational experiences, as all of ours, have been shaped by our various life experiences. So where I come from, and it's a long way from here, at the commencement of any occasion like this, it's customary that we make an acknowledgement of country. And as an Australian, we have a history that until recently failed to acknowledge the First Nations people and their ownership of land. So on arrival in a new place in Australia, one pays respect to the traditional landowners. For First Nations people of Australia, country may mean homeland, tribal or clan area, but it's more than a place on a map. And more importantly, it may mean values, places, resources, stories and cultural traditions. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders see their connection to country through their ancestors that remain custodians of their land. This evening, in recognition of the historic injustices, recognition of my heritage as an Australian-born British citizen, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country, and it's an opportunity for me to show respect to the traditional owners of the country where I was born. And the following statement is used when an Australian or other person is doing it outside of Australia, so it's official from their website. So sharing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, heritage and culture is a key part of my focus. In doing so, I acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. And I pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. Okay. So my lecture this evening draws on the values that I've learned in life, in both my personal and professional spheres. My journey to hope is one in which I explore the ideas of being, belonging and becoming. Journeys to familiar and unfamiliar locations, place, space, identities and the shaping of identity, voice and participation, feelings of belonging, aspirations and hope are the themes that characterise my research, scholarship and teaching, past, present, and I hope in the future. Making the invisible visible and asking questions that fundamentally impact on how one belongs. Recently, I went on a journey back home. The journey was timely. It enabled me to reflect on this inaugural lecture, and I remember sitting by a river in Perth, beginning to type the contents of this lecture. And it dawned on me at that moment, being back at home, the significance of this particular step in my career. The global pandemic and subsequent travel restrictions that we all felt meant that for the first time in 16 years of living in the United Kingdom, I couldn't freely return to my homeland. And being deprived of this freedom to travel home further shaped my understanding of who I am, where I belong, and what is important. The journey to hope is another transition and the convergence of many paths which have led me to this point in my career. Most importantly, our relationships. Relationships with others impact on our feelings of belonging. There have been many occasions since living in the UK where I felt like a foreigner. Migration, whether forced or chosen, brings with it a set of experiences about how you view yourself. And my family and friends will know that I often call this gap between what I know and don't know as my cultural chasm. In many ways, as a migrant, I can assimilate. I speak the language. My grandparents and great-grandparents originated from the UK, and my DNA results tell me that I have ancestors from England, Ireland, and continental Europe. So I kind of know where I come from. Identity is shaped by place, people, values, and my life experiences, and my interest in genealogy and family trees goes back to my childhood. I wasn't content with just knowing about those members of my family who were living, but I wanted to find out more about the lives of my ancestors. Some played with princes as children, served as religious counsel to kings. Others were coal and copper miners, farmers, gardeners, surveyors, engineers, pub owners, teachers, and a clockmaker. Getting back to your roots, reminding yourself of who you are, where you're from, who and what formed you in childhood, allows you to reflect and appreciate where you are now. So this journey finds me standing here in a hall, a long way from where I come from, and the formal recognition of, and it was almost embarrassing listening to what Professor Naga was reading out and realising that that's what I have done. But I'm proud of that, but it wasn't done alone, it was done with others, and in a lot of cases I was encouraged by people that are here and people who weren't able to be here this evening. But I want to dedicate this evening to those that I have worked with. It's the children, the families, the students and colleagues I've worked with over my career. And this celebration for me is not just about me, but it is about them. As you heard in the introduction from Professor Naga, I believe that education can transform lives, and I've witnessed that during my career. Unfortunately, you can't see that picture very well. But finding your place in the world, in a community, neighbourhood or family, creates a psychologically safe space to be yourself, to grow and thrive. There are times, though, when the views of others challenge or question your place. For example, I'm going to tell a few stories this evening. I was once told by an angry neighbour in Kent, who I won't characterise, but you can probably be familiar with the type of person as I tell the story. And for privacy reasons, I'm not going to say any more details about who they might be. He said to me, "Go back to where you come from." And he made the comment in anger. And it was clear to me that we had a difference of opinion about his deliberate parking in front of my driveway that made it impossible for me to get out to go to work or go shopping on a regular basis. His comment and other passive-aggressive actions, such as putting screws under my car tyres, for example, suggested that I was not welcome in my own home. And he clearly meant head back on a plane to Australia because you clearly don't fit in here. And he also suggested that I needed to learn the law of the land. He had his views, and I realised in that moment of the conversation that there was nothing I could do or say that would shift his views, because like me, he is a product of his family, culture and his life experience. So we had to agree to disagree. I sold my house and moved away. Found a nicer community. So how do you belong? When you're away from those you know, where is home, where do you belong, and how do you know when you belong? These personal questions became a curiosity with my work with students from widening participation backgrounds. Often the first member of a family to go to university, I could see them entering an unfamiliar world, like travelling to a foreign country, not being able to speak the language, unsure if you have the correct currency to make your way, and not able to read the street signs. And when we've travelled overseas, we can probably identify with that. That leads to feeling lost and confused, and sometimes you just feel like giving up and going home and having a cup of tea. This lecture is also dedicated to those students who've succeeded in education and learning in higher education, who can now use the currency competently, read the signs, and navigate their way through transitions into, through, and out of higher education. This lecture is also dedicated to my family and friends, those that can't be here this evening, and without them, I wouldn't have the resilience. And I remember just before completing my PhD, my mother took my 4-year-old daughter and said, "You stay at home for the weekend and write. You've got to finish this thing," and that was in danger of not completing, so thank you, Mum. So the significance of this day is really personal because you can't do it without your family and friends, and I just wanted to again acknowledge that. So the next section of the literature, for those of, and I realise now the audience is mostly colleagues from education, so please don't fall asleep, but I'm going to take us through a brief potted history of education and pedagogy, because that is the title of this chair. But I realise, and this is where the criticality of me as an academic comes in, talking about history can be slightly treacherous. The brief history that will be presented this evening tells one narrative. And at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the limitation of this viewpoint and recognise up front that there is a need for further interrogation about the purpose of education, and I hope that this will stimulate some discussion with colleagues in the School of Education, and that we continue to question and contest the discourses that exist in education, teaching and learning. Education and pedagogy, oops, I should have gone on a slide or two. Okay. Education and pedagogy have a symbiotic relationship, and that means pedagogy is the knowledge related to education, whereas education is the application of pedagogy. To educate is to light a fire. Like a match to the flame, an educator has the profound influence to transform. A spark of fire can change a pile of dry sticks into a bright and potentially powerful flame. When educators can find that spark in a child or a young person, that opens up the potential to learn and be educated. Pedagogy is the art or the science of teaching. In order to light the flame in learners, a teacher or pedagogue needs to know the conditions that will make good fire, and one that will be bright and sustained. And this is where my research and the values of being, belonging and becoming will articulate the link between education and pedagogy. Our current education system is not what the original thinkers intended for learning. And there have been some big names in history who've had a lot to say about education and its purpose. And even in England's history, it's littered with the names of very big thinkers. But the questions we're going to consider are, what is education for? What is the purpose of education? And most importantly, who is education for? A further perspective that we need to consider is the gap between the thoughts and actions of educators. My doctoral studies explored early childhood teachers' beliefs about learning, teaching and religious education and what that looked like in practice. And at the beginning and the end of my thesis, I borrowed some words from Johann von Goethe. And he said, "To think is easy, to act is hard, but the hardest thing in the world is to act in accordance with your thinking." So we'll come back to this a bit later. The translation of thoughts and theories into practice is mediated by a teacher's knowledge, experience and values. The curriculum that is intended is translated by the teacher and plays out in the classroom. The intended and unintended, what is included and excluded, is decided by the teacher. So here are some thoughts about some of the key thinkers, and we'll go through them. So we're going to start back in Greece with some of the big originals, Socrates, Aristotle and Plato. Plato viewed education as a core function of a just society, and that education was for all members of society, probably males, we should just put that point in there, according to their ability. Murphy suggested that according to Plato, education is a matter of leading a person from mere belief to true knowledge. Plato was interested in the rounded development where moral and intellectual pursuits led to a fulfilled life. The purpose of education, according to Plato, was to give to the body and to the soul and all the beauty and perfection of which they are capable. Education throughout English history is closely linked to the church, patronage, societal leaders, as well as some key thinkers. So we've got St. Augustine, Alcuin, Aquinas, and there were even early attempts to academise schools between the 5th century and the Middle Ages. As part of my own journey, I had the privilege of working on a World Heritage site at Canterbury Christ Church University. On that site, education has taken place since 597, when the abbey was built, and the ruins are still there today. Academisation, as I mentioned a moment ago, was first mooted in 1660 by John Milton. Whilst many of us view it as a core conservative government education policy and product of neoliberal marketisation agenda, Milton's original proposal was framed as an anti-monarchy agenda to establish schools and academies as independent of the church, state and monarch. So in essence, Milton's suggestion was an attempt to disrupt the status quo that didn't end so well for him. Not dissimilar to the removal of education from local authorities and state responsibility to corporate sponsorship and market-driven school improvement agendas. It was also during this period, we'll go over to Europe for a bit of a visit, where the close relationship between the church and education continued. John Amos Comenius, a Czech theologian and educator, viewed education as a process by which children were made good. And this view of childhood has dominated thinking and the importance of early childhood as a period in children's development, and in particular, the pedagogy and methods for teaching. Meanwhile, in France, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that education is the bringing up of children and of forming men. And in a period when the move was towards an education of the masses, German philosopher Immanuel Kant suggested that the development in man of all perfections which his nature permits was the purpose of education. And interestingly, Kant's view was not too dissimilar to the Greeks and Rousseau. In the 1690s, John Locke then proposed that workhouses should be set up for children between the age of 3 and 14. And these initiatives were closely followed by charity schools and specialist institutions for education and care. We're going to go to Switzerland next, where Johann Pestalozzi made a significant contribution to pedagogy and practice internationally. He set up children's villages in Switzerland that were visited by Robert Owen and Friedrich Froebel. And Froebel had even worked at Pestalozzi's schools before going back to Germany and setting up his own children's gardens. Inspired also by what he'd seen in Switzerland, Robert Owen, who was actually Welsh, living in Scotland, that was another form of ecumenism back there. It's, Welsh for Scotland anyway. We'll leave the jokes out, I think. He went back to New Lanark, where he had some cotton mills, and he was focused on improving the quality of life for children. He asserted that children were formed by conditions beyond their control, and he really wanted to focus on character education, and his schools in New Lanark became models in the early 1800s. So the history of education to date is dominated by Western thought and men. And interestingly, in the early 1900s, in a very traditional Catholic country, in the seat of the Catholic Church in the slums of Rome, that Maria Montessori set out to be a bit of a revolutionary. She set out to educate the uneducable. She was an extraordinary woman of her time, first female doctor, a single mother with a child out of marriage, which were very frowned upon at the time, and she tackled the education of poor children, taught them skills that would lead to employment and improve their prospects for a better life. Over in the US of A, John Dewey, in the early 20th century, was busy trying to democratise education, and he argued that education should be a process of living, not a process for future living. And I think that's something that we forget today, and we're always preparing children for the next steps and not living in the moment and appreciating what they know now. The 20th century also saw the impact of science, and the theories of learning dominated this period of education. The development of intelligence tests in the cognitivism theories. Human behaviour was explained by behaviourists such as Skinner, where learning was thought to be as a stimulus and response. But we now know, as time has gone on, that humans have a greater capacity to build on this learning and become more and more sophisticated in their responses. Theories from constructivists such as Jean Piaget, Vygotsky and Loris Malaguzzi, a personal favourite of mine, who is a founder of schools in Reggio Emilia in Italy. Then came along the humanists, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who were very focused on how human needs drove behaviour. In the latter part of the 20th century, we'll go back to Paulo Freire, who I quoted earlier, and his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, promoted education as a means of building critical consciousness. And this was intended to be emancipatory and allow people to act as agents and change their lives. This approach to education politicised the role of teachers and students explicitly and encouraged agency for students. So there are traces of all of these key thinkers in our education and pedagogy practice today. The reality is, for us as educators, that education is inherently political and it's sociological in its function. Education throughout history has been a function by which the values of society are enculturated into the next generation. And through the curriculum in its broadest sense, What is taught, what is not taught, what is explicitly taught and implicitly learned and experienced are the modes by which learners learn how to be and who to become. Education takes place in a community, and fitting in or belonging is a key part of the learning process. So there's a theme throughout the history of education about emancipation from poverty and improvement of the quality of life as being a driver for educational change. And we now live in a period of marketisation of education. What has changed is the pursuit of knowledge and development of the whole person has been reduced into the neoliberal pursuit of profits and metrics, which seem at odds with original intentions and purpose of education. So in my view, what has been lost in Western education with the advent of league tables is the dialogue about the nature and purpose of education and how we as pedagogues or educators or teachers or whoever we want to call ourselves adapt our approaches to learning in the changing world. And there are risks around the corner for the future of education, and in particular, the use of technology and the advances. For example, the use of artificial intelligence does present some interesting moral and ethical questions about the nature of human learning, the purpose of schooling, and potentially the value of qualifications and those who award them. Can teachers or educators be replaced with robots? Would they be more efficient? That's a question for a whole other lecture, I suspect. So the key thinkers have shaped us in the past mostly come from, as I said before, Western traditions and were mostly men. So what's needed in the future is diversity of thought, perspective, and we need to be thinking about the future, about what education might be. We need to begin to reshape education so that wider perspectives can be included, and no doubt this will disrupt and challenge the status quo. What is needed now, post-COVID, is an opportunity for us to revisit those initial questions that I raised. What is education for? Who is education for? And another question, are the foundations we rest on the right ones for the future in terms of us being a more inclusive society? And so this is where I'm going to go through the being, belonging and becoming bit. This is one of my all-time favourite quotes, and I think it did help me to understand myself and the being, belonging, becoming. That was shortly after I made a visit to Reggio Emilia in Italy. And the quote is, knowing where you are, where you find yourself, helps you to develop your sense of personal identity, your uniqueness, as well as your place in the world. Every place has its own spirit, its own past, its own aspirations. And the spirit comes from the land, and in Greek they call it autokono, coming from the land. And that's why for me this journey to hope is like coming home, and there are so many roads that have converged to be here. So we are products of our home and culture and our family experiences. And my reference earlier to the definition of country, that the First Nations people of Australia, it's really important to understand where you're from. So, telling my story, I need to tell you some things about my journey through education, because it's not straightforward. At the end of secondary school, I didn't get the grades to get into university, and at that point I didn't know what I wanted to do, who I wanted to be. But I had an opportunity to retake my final year of school, and I had a teacher who unlocked my learning superpowers. I learned how to learn. And that was in stark contrast to a previous teacher who'd suggested to my parents at a parent-teacher evening that a career in hospitality, tourism or hairdressing was where I should aim my sights. Definitely not a future in university, and that was definitely not encouraged. But that car ride home with my parents after that parent-teacher conference was interesting, let me say, and that's why I'm here today, I think. So what my teachers thought about me was not meant to be. I learned how to learn, I exceeded the grades required, and as Professor Naga went through what I did in terms of my academic, I'm not going to go over that again, but my career was about my own journey. I felt confident about learning, and working with people who had a really tough start in life has been something really important. Sorry. I'm going to tell you another story about doing my Masters of Education. At that point, I re-engaged with learning theories. My day job was leading curriculum and pedagogy, and I was working in quite an innovative setting, so we could really push the boundaries, and we actually had permission to do some really creative things. And it was at the time when Lev Vygotsky's work was being translated from Russian. This was back in the 1990s, so I'm going to date myself a little. But it was the first time it was really being explored in Western literature. And what exposure to Vygotsky's work did was it really helped me name what that relationship was between teaching and learning. And so that theory and that introduction fueled my interest in teachers' beliefs and practice. And I changed jobs, and I went to teach a reception class in a Catholic school. And in Catholic schools in Australia at the time, there was no national curriculum. Each school or each state had its own state curriculum, but each Catholic diocese, and there were 27 in Australia, had their own religious education syllabus. So it's a pretty interesting experience. So I remember walking into a meeting on my first day and a conversation with the religious education coordinator to try and find out what I needed to do with preschool, because there was no curriculum for 5-year-olds. And she said to me, take the Year 1 RE syllabus and water it down. And for me, I thought, how do you water down a syllabus? And I just went off and did what I did, and we played and we explored religious education topics as it came from the children's interests, as well as doing some we had to do. But it was in this conversation that my interest around the mismatch between what teachers do and say became the jumping off point for my doctoral studies. But it was whilst I was on my maternity leave and I started to do some work at Australian Catholic University, I began to tutor and mentor Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who were studying in higher education for the first time. Many of them didn't even have the qualifications to get into university, but we'd designed a program that enabled them to come into university so that they could go back and teach in their local communities. And these students, I was always blown away by their courage. They faced such significant barriers to participating in education, but they were so keen to learn. And with their very, very complex personal lives, without many of the resources that many of our students take for granted. And this for me was a really formative experience in working with students from diverse backgrounds. It's driven me to make education accessible, and I've seen the way in which education transforms individuals, not only students' lives, but their children, grandchildren, and local communities. So when I completed, as Professor Naga said, my PhD, I decided to spread my wings, metaphorically, and fly to the other side of the world to take up a job at Canterbury Christchurch. And where I was working at QUT before I came, I was working in a corridor with professors and lecturers who'd known me since I was 18. So it seemed like I was never going to be allowed to be who I needed to be in that particular corridor. So my research about teachers' beliefs and practice was something that I applied in my leadership roles in higher education, trying to work with my colleagues to look at what barriers they were putting in their teaching and learning, which actually prevented students from engaging. And we were able to have conversations and really transform the curriculum for our students. I first wrote about belonging, being and becoming, as it was, in 2011, when I linked my PhD to a new early years curriculum in Australia. But prior to that, starting about 2007, the early childhood studies curriculum at Canterbury Christchurch needed a massive overhaul. And when I first started there, it was myself and one other person with 3 campuses and 800 students. It wasn't a great student-staff ratio. So I built a team of professionals who were coming in from various backgrounds, and the dominating policy at the time was Every Child Matters, where we had teams around the child. So I brought in social workers, early childhood educators, psychologists, a former police officer, and former paediatric nurses, and we all brought different perspectives of childhood, and that was a really enriching professional experience. And because they were all new to higher education, I had a bit of work to do in terms of enculturating them into higher education, starting off with PGCEs, masters, and then doctorates. But we had conversations about our various perspectives about children and childhood, and I needed to find something that would bring us together. I came across some research which talked about children as beings rather than becomings, and this then became the focus of the curriculum that we developed. And we wanted to talk about that in terms of our own students coming into higher education. We saw increasingly that we were seeing more students from widening participation backgrounds, and they, like children in their transitions, needed to have a space where they could explore their identity, belong, and become the person that they hoped or aspired to be. Also alongside this was the key points about voice and participation. And like Paulo Freire talked about giving people agency, this was also important. I did some co-research. I was a very busy course leader and didn't have time for research, so I decided I'd build it into my teaching. And I built a 3-year research project that I called What Matters to Children. And so when I'd arrived in the UK, Every Child Matters was the policy of the Labor government at the time. But what always puzzled me was that the 5 pillars that were linked to economic prosperity and broader societal aims didn't actually consider the views of childhood. So we turned this module into a research project, and the collaborative project over 3 years, we began to speak to children about what was important to them. And interestingly, the research brought to life the policy narrative, and it also promoted the value of listening to children. And interestingly, children are experts in their own lives, and this is something that we need to remember. So in answering the question for myself about who am I, my academic role, and as Professor Naga talked about that award for excellence that I got at the University of Portsmouth, that for me is the culmination of my research work. It was bringing together innovation, research and teaching. And what we were able to do was, during the pandemic, do some research with colleagues who were new, and I was able to mentor them. We were able to create a solution for the university who were concerned about staff working from home and having childcare responsibilities, but we also had a body of students who needed to do placement. So the solution of the Study Buddy Club meant that we were able to satisfy all 3 demands, and actually our students were able to have paid employment by doing the placement. So belonging, where do we belong? I'm going to go back to some neuroscience research here, not in a lot of detail, but as humans, our brain is tuned to finding environments that enable us to survive with good health, well-being. And as this area of research expands, and we need to be aware of how we as educators can take account of that. I think I've lost a page, but anyway, I'll move on. So belonging is something that's important for us to have as humans. If feeling like home is where you belong, how does one belong when you're away from home? And with whom do you belong? This was a question that I explored, particularly with students transitioning into higher education. Now, I've got some experience of feeling like an outsider. As a migrant, belonging has been something, that's been personal. As a parent, I've watched my daughter's experience as a white, English-speaking migrant, and it was sometimes an experience of invisibility. By that I mean we could fit in, we spoke the language, but the cultural chasm we experienced was often met with sarcastic comments and othering because of the lack of shared knowledge. I even had a student after my first lecture when I arrived saying, "Your PowerPoint was so good," and I did retort with, "We did have electricity in Australia," because it was kind of a bit condescending, but it was good because the student and I had already established quite a good relationship. My experiences personally have allowed me to reflect on students coming to university as the first person in their family to do so. They gain the qualifications to make it through the rite of passage to come to university, but what I've seen too often, they've lacked the cultural capital. It might be their class, it might be previous educational experiences, They may not know others who've been successful in higher education and may not have those role models. Knowing how a university works, how one behaves and how one succeeds is very important, but it's not just something you learn. You actually have to sometimes spell it out for our students. The transition from A-level education to university in this country also presents challenges. The school exam system and curriculum doesn't adequately support the transition into higher education. And we as universities don't help either. We pride ourselves on students being able to learn independently from the outset, and yet too many students fail to succeed in the first year. So the cold turkey independent learning approach to pedagogy in higher education fails to scaffold students from where they start to where they need to be. So as you've heard, my academic home is in education, with the education of teachers, professional development of teachers and leaders, and not just in schools, but in the wider children's workforce. My sense of belonging comes from my learning communities and my journey to hope, and I've only been here for 2 months, but I feel like I've been here for about 10 years. I haven't had the salary for 10 years, but it's only 2 months. But it is a place of welcome and it is a place of belonging. But all of these experiences have allowed me to engage in current debates about learning and teaching. Exploring what it means to belong and how it feels has shaped how I work with students in higher education. And here's just a couple of things to remember. When you feel like you belong, you feel valued, included, respected and understood. You feel safe, welcome, happier and relaxed. When you belong, you can learn and develop, and your well-being and health is positive. When you belong, you can build relationships based on trust, respect and value differences. Experiencing this and being able to reciprocate that with others. Now that's taken from early childhood literature, but it's also very relevant to higher education. To create environments that enable belonging in higher education, what I've done over the years is attempted to reconceptualise students with my colleagues, recognising our students' expertise and what they bring, and their role as co-participants in the learning community. We also need to reflect on the power dynamics that we have in universities and giving some of that power to our students as co-creators of knowledge, and allowing them to have that ownership can really transform the way we work. So to understand and appreciate students and their experience, for me as an educator, I need to be concerned with the being. Who are our students? What do they bring? Belonging. How do we create a community of learners where people can succeed and thrive? And becoming. How do we support the aspirations of students to enable success in spite of the barriers to learning that they experience along the way? So my experience in rethinking curriculum, both the formal and informal, and embedding being, belonging, becoming, have really helped to shape how we view students. And what we need to move from is our students being passive recipients of knowledge that we give them to being active participants in learning. There are many parallels between teaching in higher education and working with young children, but I don't tell any of our higher education students that I'm comparing them with 5-year-olds. What we do need to recognise are the transitions that young children make as they go through their education system, and even general life transitions. Our students coming to us at university, those transitions are still real and they're still very big. So, I'm just going to give you one example from my research. I developed a student experience evaluation questionnaire, and what I was really keen to do was evaluate what students thought in their first 6 months at university. And what was really interesting from that survey, I collected the data over 5 years, and then we also put in some interventions where we improved the student experience as we went along. And what we saw was a great improvement in the National Student Survey scores. We started at 50% when I took over in 2000 and ended over 90% after the end of the 5 years. But it was a transformation of curriculum. It was a transformation of how we saw our learners. And that work I did on that particular project we really focused on belonging in higher education and enhancing the student experience and making sure that our curriculum was inclusive, and it created a space for students to attempt assessment that was high stakes, but also building informative assessment to what we were doing. As Professor Naga mentioned, the 3 Bs, the being, belonging, becoming, have been adopted by the University of Portsmouth Academy Trust. And for me, that was probably a really significant thing, because the teachers and the head teachers were sitting around talking about what was going to be the vision and values, and they all came with their various schools. And I said, this sounds like some 3 Bs that I know about. And when I talked about it, it was at that moment that they said, yes, that is what we want. And it's been exciting to see that grow. I think for those colleagues familiar with education pedagogy might be thinking, is she really just talking about relational pedagogy? I kind of am, but I'm also going to expand on that a little. Relational pedagogy, for those non-educators, is described as a type of pedagogy that prioritises relationships between teachers and students. The being, belonging and becoming approach to education goes a step further than just prioritising relationships. The pedagogy is contextualised. The relations take place at a time, space, place, and it's the journey of the learners in this space that is personalised and potentially empowering. Finding your tribe, as I like to say, whether that be in your subject area, with flatmates, sporting teams, societies or classmates, is an important aspect of coming to university. Feeling like you belong allows for self-expression and growth, and for our students to become the person that they will become through the whole education process. What a contextualised policy does is recognise transition and change. It promotes the importance of social contacts and connection, choice and autonomy, power and control. And what we need to recognise as students are transitioning through their higher education is the difference between the old and new. And I often think of the Educating Rita film and the number of students that I've worked with in the past that may be mature women who have gone through that kind of transformation. So what we need to do is reduce the feelings of otherness that we experience in higher education, and that should be the aim of pedagogy. Our geographies in education are highly contextualised, and the nuance of this type of pedagogy is that it's transitional and people move through that. And it's nested in the context of we form relationships with others, and it will change over time, and those relationships and reliances will change. So becoming. On reflection, my becoming is a lifelong journey, and it's not over yet. It's about education, pedagogy, and the thing I feel most passionate about is making a difference through the transformational possibilities that education creates. As a reflective educator, this lecture is a summary of what I've done so far. And as a school leaver in 1986, I never would have imagined that I would be standing here in a room like this, doing this so many years later. In the same way, when our freshers walk in on that first day of university, and they come into university with faith and hope, and they imagine a better future for themselves, we need to think back to that day for us. One can become whoever they want when the climate and conditions enable them to thrive. Students who perceive that everything is possible can achieve what they set out to do. Sadly, the impact of COVID-19 has been very challenging for young people, and consequently they've lost confidence in themselves, lost connections, and online learning meant that they didn't feel like they belonged. So getting students back onto campus means supporting them to connect, and we as academics need to dig deep and find new ways of supporting that reconnection and engagement, and draw on wider pedagogical approaches so we can foster genuine collaboration, support communication, and scaffold our students to become independent and confident learners. I'm getting towards the end, so please bear with me. So I wanted to end with thinking about what will I offer Liverpool Hope, the School of Education, in this particular chair of Professor of Education and Pedagogy. So I see my role, it feels a bit like a job interview presentation, so I've already got the job, so hopefully it'll stay for a bit longer. I see my role as being one that promotes research and scholarship for educators. And this starts with my colleagues, about engaging us in conversations about the purpose and nature of education, about us pursuing research and scholarship so that we can ensure that the next generation of teachers and graduates that come from Liverpool Hope, that go out to work with children and young people, are prepared to understand the privilege and power that their role has. And I'd really like us to think about, what is a Hope teacher in the next generation? What is a Hope education graduate and a Hope early childhood graduate? What do they look like, and what do we hope and aspire for them? We need to ensure that they are equipped for a rapidly changing policy and practice landscape that's highly regulated and really continues to reduce the autonomy of teachers, and we feel that ourselves with our autonomy in higher education in initial teacher training being edged away. We need to ensure that we engage ourselves in conversations about the ethics of artificial intelligence, decolonising the curriculum, and making education a more inclusive experience for children and young people. Just some examples. Others can have some other ideas too. I know education transforms lives. And as a teacher of more than 30 years, I have stories to testify to this power. I'm going to have to skip through a few slides because I realise that, So anyway, for those of you who've been into my office, there's a small framed picture. And at the end of my first year of teaching, a child gave me this gift. And it says, "To teach is to touch a life forever." Now, for me, that statement has been profound, and it has really shaped how I've viewed education. Sometimes as a teacher, and for those of you who are teachers sitting here, you don't always know what happens to the small children that you teach and where they end up. And I think one of the key things is that you know that you may have made some difference, but you're never quite sure. But I'm going to tell you about our unexpected, and some colleagues will have heard this story, about a child that I did find out what happened to them. Now, I was a Year 1 teacher in 1997 at Proserpine State School, which is on the Barrier Reef, a very nice place. And I'm going to share with you the story about David. David was a typical 6-year-old, and I was told before he started school that he had special needs. And on the first day, the children were out climbing on the climbing equipment, and he was hanging from one arm, very ably, but he was sort of swinging and jumping to the next bar. I needed to demonstrate that. I couldn't quite put that in words. So David has cerebral palsy, which meant that one side of his body was not always as reliable as he wanted. It was rigid, less flexible. And in the classroom, he struggled with fine motor skills. But he made friends easily, and that was a big plus for David, and he got other children to do his writing for him and also his maths. He was a very canny young man. I always remember that. So living in a country town in North Queensland, David, like many other children, were learning to ride their bicycles. And every afternoon, as school finished, I'd help David put on his bicycle helmet, and he would ride off across the playground with his friends. 15 years later, I'm sitting in London, or in the UK rather, and I'm watching the Olympics and Paralympics, cheering on all the Australians, and I was really excited to see this gold medal. David, the boy I taught as a 6-year-old, winning a gold medal in the Paralympics for road racing representing Australia. He's still cycling today, and that's quite a few years ago. As a teacher, you really get an insight to where children end up. So for me, that simple act of putting on his helmet, setting him off, I didn't have any idea that that would have an impact. But it's just those little things we do as teachers that you just don't know. Bill Ayres, who's written a lot about the power of teaching, says this, and I think this is something for us as educators we need to remember. The fundamental message of a teacher is this: you can change your life. Whoever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, the teacher invites you to a second chance, another round, perhaps a different conclusion. What a teacher does is posit possibility, openness and alternatives. The teacher points to what could be, but what is not yet. And the teacher beckons you to change your path. And so the basic rule of a teacher is to teach. Education, of course, is the arena of hope and struggle, hope for a better life, and struggle over how to understand and act and achieve that better life. So as educators, we have such a power and a privilege. And as educators in higher education, we can't forget that. Education of the whole person is really important, and we've seen a lot of emphasis in the last few years about young people's health and well-being as learners. And that's very connected to what we do in early childhood. And I'm just skipping over a few pages. I'm going to conclude, I think. So, Liverpool Hope, and it's a real privilege to work here, has a well-documented history with education. And it seems logical that we focus on the past, present and future as an appropriate way to conclude the lecture. I feel really, really humbled standing here, standing on the shoulders of the giants who have created what we have today. We have a unique ecumenical university that was founded by some very brave people who sought social justice, creating a space in education for women, Catholics and Jews. The long history and traditions of this university mean that our future can rightly be ambitious, one that is based on social justice, and as we continue to pursue excellence in research, scholarship, innovation and our teaching, and take education at Hope into a new era. In thinking what next, the challenge for us as educators in higher education is that we engage in research and scholarship about the relational, contextual and transitional pedagogies, that is being, belonging and becoming. And as I said before, post-COVID-19, it's more important than ever. An education that promotes justice in all aspects can transform lives and offer our students the possibility to become more than they ever dreamed was possible. And I can draw on lots of research here, but I think we've got a really good starting place with the 10 principles of learning and teaching that we have for this university. I've got a couple of tweaks I might add to it along the way, but in terms of, might just make them suggestions later to you, Penny, afterwards. But I think what we really need to do is build on giving really serious consideration to learners' voice, and so that it's authentic and it's absolutely central to what we know, what we do. So what do our students know? What do they think? And how do they learn? And it's not just one size fits all. And we as educators need to understand our role in the process. We need to understand what our behaviour, what we do in the classroom, what we don't do, what we know and what we don't know, and what the things we do and why we do them. We need to reflect on that, and it's more than just peer observation, it's a deep reflection and questioning about what we do. We need to engage our students in a dialogue, and we need to build on what they know and what they've experienced and bring that in a live way into the curriculum. And that means we need to really think about how we do things, why we do them, how we do our groupings, how we do our assessment, and really think about how we can do less delivery but more engaging with our students. And what we need to do ultimately is make sure that we promote equity and that we cater for the diverse range of learners that we have. Knowing that I've got half a room of teachers, teacher educators here, we know this, and I think we need to really have these conversations about what we do and why we do it. So in conclusion, I'd like to say, and I hope it's been clear, that I think education and pedagogy are absolutely linked. And I think what we in the School of Education going forward will think about how they relate and what we need to do. I'm going to conclude, because this is my German friend again, Goethe, because I think this is the hardest bit for us and it's the greatest challenge. We can think about these things and we can talk about them, but to take action, to change what we're doing, is hard. And doing those things, the way we think and being able to revolutionise things is actually the hardest thing. So we've all got a challenge ahead. So thank you very much.
Vice-Chancellor, colleagues, friends, guests, it's my absolute pleasure to respond to Professor Carroll-Meehan's inaugural lecture. From the first moment I met Cate, I knew that she'd be a great addition to the Hope community. That's because she completely understands what's important to this university, as you've just heard. Her lecture this evening has further underlined that perfect fit. Cate has taken us on a journey, exploring themes in her research, particularly recognising the value within education of place, identities, voice, belonging, aspirations, not leaving out hope. The fact that she crystallises these in the notion of being, belonging and becoming reveals an undeniable and concrete link to the Hope approach to higher education. The Hope approach focuses on the search for truth, beauty and goodness within a collegium which offers students personal attention and engagement and delivers a research-informed curriculum. Education of the whole person is central to Cate's philosophy of education and pedagogy and also to our ongoing endeavour here at Hope. Our Hope approach to higher education is inclusive. The university seeks to develop the individual in a distinctive manner by encouraging their belonging to a community which focuses on personal relationships. As Cate has so clearly explained to us, the student becoming a graduate with a strong moral and social purpose is by its nature a transformative and essential process. Cate has explained how her research has focused on the values of these approaches in a wider context, how being, belonging and becoming are key to the success of all students. This clearly affirms Hope's long-term commitment to the transformation of students and the formation of citizens equipped to do the work of the world as well as joining the world of work. As we enter Advent and indeed approach the time of year when we celebrate our Foundation Day, it's appropriate that Cate's lecture concluded with reference to the founding roots of this university. As she's reminded us, Liverpool Hope's well-documented history begins with education. Our constitution requires us to educate teachers, and particularly those destined to work in faith schools. Our wider mission tasks us all with the integration of Christian values into the work of the university and the education of teachers. And who could argue with being, belonging and becoming in this context? Hope continues to have a significant impact both nationally and internationally through research, scholarship, innovation and teaching. Cate is now a significant player in this endeavour with the exciting challenge of leading education at Hope into a new era. Before I close, I want to ask Cate to take on an additional challenge, as if the one we haven't given her isn't big enough. Cate, I need your support in ensuring that the next generation of women scholars are inspired and supported to succeed. We need to work towards increased representation of women, like Cate, in senior positions and continue to find ways to support our colleagues in their academic and leadership aspirations. This is, of course, for their own careers, but also as role models for the thousands of students, both male and female, who are in our care. I'm sure, Cate, that you're going to be a source of inspiration in that endeavour. Thank you for your lecture, which I'm sure everyone in this room has enjoyed. Thank you for joining the Hope community. We have a great deal to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horn, and thank you very much, lecturer, for the evening. Cate, what came across clearly in your lecture is your passion for education and your commitment, like all of us in this Senate room, our commitment that through education, human beings are liberated. I experienced that myself in my own life, living under apartheid. But you did mention Educating Rita in your lecture, this great play which has been filmed, written by Willie Russell. And you probably don't know that Willie Russell graduated from this place. Yes, he did. and he was a hairdresser. Yes. And then decided much later in life to become a teacher and came and studied education here. And now, of course, he's one of the best-known modern playwrights in the country. And in fact, he studied in this part of the campus before we became an ecumenical foundation. I had the great privilege, one of the most famous students I ever met from a university, I met in Pretoria. He was in prison, and he used his time in prison to finish his law degree. And he did it through my university. And because he was in prison for his so-called rejection of apartheid, he couldn't come out to get his degree. And then when he did, I happened to be on the Senate and the Council. And I was part of the welcoming party to welcome Mr. Mandela to the university to receive his degree. And in prison, he did exactly what you recommended. He was urging his fellow prisoners to get their degrees, to study through the university. And he set the example by studying. Because he said, education is liberation. I was moved by a story of David. I saw a prisoner become president of a democratic South Africa, and you saw that little boy with a disability win gold. It's wonderful, isn't it? And isn't that what makes our work as educators, as scholars, worthwhile? It's worth getting out of bed for, and it's worth working at a place like this that's committed to that vision. So congratulations, and thank you very much, Cate. Would you come forward, please, and accept a little gift from us to mark the evening? Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll all have a chance now to greet Cate at the door. And if you'll make your way to the door first, let me also say that being my last inaugural lecture at Hope, I'm delighted to have the full set, both my Deputy Vice-Chancellors, including Kenneth, and of course the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research. So this is the last time the four of us will be together on an occasion like this. So there it is, and thank you everybody for coming. Thank you.